5 minutes. Hello, everyone. So now we are all set, and we are broadcasting online on Facebook, and we have attendees coming. So I think we can start.
Okay, so our greetings from Kyiv. This is a very special event. My name is Natalia Gumenyuk. I'm a Ukrainian journalist, and I'm privileged to launch this event. This is the unusual start of Zero Corruption Conference. At these days, all the people who are supposed to come to Kyiv, and we should be at the incredibly innovative conference uniting the fight of the corruption, searching for the solution for future, and also visiting Chernobyl, because today is the 34th anniversary of the tragedy. Kyiv at this day looks unusual for us because it's probably as empty as it was 34 years. It wasn't empty 34 years ago, but it was empty in early March 1986. And now we found that our event should be postponed because, of course, due to the COVID-19 global pandemics. I want to explain you what is the Corruption Conference. It was initiated by the Anti-Corruption Action Center, the largest Ukrainian civil society organization holding back major political corruption in Ukraine. And this conference is organized in partnership with the leading expert and think tanks from Europe and the United States. But we are looking forward to see you in Kyiv this autumn, hopefully. We're really quite sure that may happen. But we don't want to wait because there are a lot of important things to discuss. And today we are launching this
privileged to be participating in this conference, and I look forward to our discussion. I'm sorry that it couldn't be held this year at Chernobyl, but hopefully next year on the 25th anniversary, maybe that will be, I guess 35th, that'll be possible. So I don't think that this is unprecedented, but it is unprecedented in the lifetime, I think, of anybody here, that you have a crisis that is global, that has occurred as quickly as it has, and that is likely to have as deep economic consequences for almost everybody everywhere in the world. But I do think actually that it's quite appropriate that in a way we're doing this in commemoration of Chernobyl, because there's a lot of similarities, I think, between these two crises. They are in certain ways both products of modern technology. Obviously the virus is not modern, but the transmission through a globalized system of international travel and trade is something that's been brought about by the technological conditions of our age. I think the national threat that it suddenly presents is extremely similar, and I think that the response of different kinds of governments to it are also very similar, because one of the big differences that's emerging between national responses to the crisis are those governments that have tried to cover up what has been happening, that have suppressed information, and basically look to their short-term interests, versus governments that were transparent and open and took advice, from the appropriate experts, and then designed public policy responses around that. And so in that respect, I think we're actually seeing a replay of Chernobyl, where, we're discovering actually which governments are capable and which are not.
So I would probably ask everybody to refer, but Serhiy, as a historian, so is it as anything else in the history, also as for you, also as an expert of the histories in this region where I'm physically in?
Well, I certainly agree with Francis that in terms of the economic impact on the world as a whole, our traveling, again, our conference that is now happening on Zoom format is one of the examples of that. So our life really changed in a major way that it wasn't changed maybe in the last 100 years. But so far in terms of the
lessons, Europe, mankind, we all can have. Rebecca, it's your turn. We are ready to hear you.
Yeah. So I actually, I'm not sure whether the lessons to be learned from Chernobyl are in a way agreed. So I think there are different camps in our societies on different issues, and some have different conclusions from the experience of Chernobyl than others. And so from my point of view, in some countries, especially also in Ukraine, the right lessons from this Chernobyl disaster, from the catastrophe, have not, so from what I think, have not been done. So I was very happy actually when this HBO serial came out. I saw it soon after it was available. And I immediately understood that this serial could be a tool to make the next generation in Ukraine understand what really happened and how this event in the past has still a grip on today and on the future. And so Natalia, that I hope very much that Ukraine at a certain moment will be able to set up a strategic plan for the energy sector, focusing on not only more independence from Russia, but also on sustainable, climate-friendly and low-risk ideas and technologies. And for me, this would be still the lesson to be drawn from Chernobyl.
I would refer to Roman and Miranda because, and I'm speaking now again more about the pandemics, but I know that Roman, you've been in Moscow, you've been young, you've been in school, when there was the tragedy, so your memories are still there. I'm speaking about the Chernobyl tragedy. But for you, as the people who are dealing with the corruption, we will go on more about this topic, of course, later, because, it's so connected to the healthcare, to environment, to everything. But what are your also concerns? Now, at the moment of the pandemics, what do you think are really the things which happened and which won't be like they were maybe 3-4 months ago? Or it's more or less the same in your, field? Probably Roman or Miranda. Oh, Roman already starting. Yeah.
I think that it is less of a Chernobyl effect, but more of an economic crisis effect. And at the moment, the financial system must be going into overload because of the flood of dirty money coming from kleptocracies like Russia, like emerging economies, where it is pretty normal for any economic crisis where people are trying to, whatever they could illegally get their hands on, steal and stash it away in some offshore zones. I mean, this is something that we will realize later, like at the end of the year when we see the Russian central bank statistics, for example, when we're going to see the capital flight from Russia, when we're going to see
COVID supplies, and they're realizing that organized crime groups are getting involved in supplying them to the government. They're realizing that people who are politically connected are providing supplies from the government, and of course an overpriced way. So they're basically making profit. So for us,
Region,
compared
about
to their
our region,
neighbors
about
in
the global.
controlling. Because is, democracy.
The lack of we are able to look in every
our other issues, because authoritarian regimes are about hiding the information. So how do you see really how much silencing is possible in
things that otherwise they wouldn't be allowed, or they would be. Also, what I'm thinking is, the crisis is a perfect opportunity for
boycotts of shipments and goods, but the world never responded to with any serious international sanctions slapped on the USSR. Now it's being suggested by, for example, a large UK think tank, conservative think tank, the Henry Jackson Society, that China should be penalized by imposing fines up to $6 trillion. Whether it's possible or not, whether it's practical, it's a different story. But what does the panel think about, should the countries like China and Russia be penalized?
I really want you to all answer, and that really could be very interesting thoughts, because it's true that I've also reread this part of the Serhi's book, that in times when the big country and basic, such a very powerful country, you need somehow the cooperation. In the 1986, the West needed to cooperate with Soviet Union in order to know at least part of the truth. So there was some kind of, discussion that, okay, you say this, but we won't fully punish you. Now also, Francis, maybe it's also for you the question. We also hear in the US political discussion, there is a discussion about, doing something with China, but also we understand that at this moment, the world needs to cooperation. And I think it's all the hard issue. I think like for Europe, it's a big, always Brussels, a huge issue, how you deal with, these great big countries when you need to cooperation. So Francis, maybe you may start, but I want everybody somehow respond to that. Thanks to Roman for bringing it.
Well, I don't think that sanctioning China is really the way to go, because first of all, given how big and powerful it is, you're never going to get anybody to agree to do that internationally. And I think the larger problem is that there are a lot of people at fault for making this pandemic happen. It's not just the Chinese. I mean, a lot of decisions were made in very many countries that were very bad. I mean, the Italians did not respond nearly quickly enough when they saw evidence of this happening. So do you sanction them as well? And like I said, I don't think that the blame simply falls on a single country. However, I do think that it's very important to get some transparency after the fact as to what actually happened. And I think, Roman is right. There's a lot of evidence that China really was covering up information at the time. It's possible that that's continuing now. And so I think a more useful focus of these efforts is to actually get China to be open right in the present, because that will actually give us information that will help other countries understand the pandemic and its sources and come up with better responses.
Who will get into this? Let me know. Serhi.
Yes. Well, I think it's a great question, and I also believe that it's good that it is being raised. I don't think that we'll get too far in terms of getting actual compensation, but the question that the discussion is there, it's important, because there is a responsibility for hiding information from the rest of the world. The way forward, the way how I see it, again, now we are all trying to save ourselves by building the walls, by closing the borders. And again, there is a certain logic and point in doing that. But I don't think this is the way how we can move forward. And Chernobyl, in terms of lessons of Chernobyl, it's very interesting in a sense that unlike Fukushima or 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl produced a significant body of international legislation about early warning, about sharing the information. And after Chernobyl, the Soviet Union actually opened its own nuclear industry that was super secret for the international advice and for international inspections. I personally believe that we would have another Chernobyl if that opening wouldn't happen. And I think that to a degree that we can turn this discussion about not reparations, but about some compensation, into dialogue in which we can empower World Health Organization or other international organizations to help them get access to the closed societies as China. That could be one positive thing coming out of that pandemic, because again, pandemics happen in the world. It's already the fourth one in the last 100 years, and our belief that we mastered that there will be no pandemics in the future, that we are scientifically so powerful, they're not based on reality. So again, the point is how to, I think it is good that that conversation was started. The question is how to turn it into something that can bring actual results, positive results.
Rebecca, what do you think about any kind of sanctions? You know, I think like you were in Brussels for a while, where always you knew that this is quite a hard decision.
Only to remind you, the sanctions debate in 1986 after Chernobyl would not have been possible and also would not have been reasonable. Our interest in Europe was that the Soviet Union manages to get the control in this disastrous situation. And so there was more the debate about how can we support the construction of the first sarcophagus, and then also later on the cleanup. Because the negative impact of a failure of the cleanup and the catastrophe control in the first months, the impact on Europe would have been huge, like the impact was during the days of the open fire in Block 4. So sanctions then was. So the opposite of sanction was the right thing to do, I would say. The Soviet Union was punished enough, because Chernobyl catastrophe, also from my point of view, and I agree with many historians on this, was a kind of the last push for the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I would like for China to support what Serhii said. So we need a proper and transparent investigation about what happened and how. And one of my concerns, and there's also a parallel to Chernobyl, one of my concerns is that WHO, the World Health Organization, is not only so correctly funded, but also not well prepared to deal in an independent way with these kind of issues.
So, and that's exactly the moment I want to give a floor to Miranda, because of course we were referred to a number of investigations, but I would also say that, for instance, one of our questions from the audience was, it's from Studio Zanello Lenny Tiring. Can you suggest frameworks for bringing more transparency? And that's, I know you something worried, first of all. Our panelist mentioned that, of course, maybe, you are doing some investigation. We know, now you're looking at the corruptions, but probably, I think it's not 1986. Some things can be known already now. Let us know what we can know already now about the COVID-19 investigations.
Well, sadly, investigating China is extremely difficult. There is an issue with transparency. There is an issue with government control over what news comes out of the country and what access people have. So, if you think about it, people, reporters are trying to even check supplies and the companies from China who are providing aid, and they're not able to even find out who is behind them. So the big problem for reporting about China in general is a lack of transparency. It's a lack of public access, and then also the government ability to hide what needs to be hidden. The problem with COVID is that by the time that anybody goes back to investigate, there won't be a paper trail. And it will be very difficult to actually find the proper paper trail and really establish what was happening and when it was happening. For the reporters here, I mean, our teams are obviously looking into procurement. They're looking into emergency spending. We are actually now very much interested in reputation laundering. We are noticing, in particular in Central Asia, that some of the groups reported about, from the aspect of corruption and theft of public funds, are actually now appearing as the major donors of supplies, and in a way, getting reputation of the heroes. We're also noticing that, crime groups are getting very innovative in the ways that they are using this crisis to go about their own business. So there's a lot to investigate, and there's a lot to pay attention. I mean, the obvious thing, we're talking about billions of dollars that will be spent to rescue economy and, bring countries back to where they were before the crisis. And it's going to be a great opportunity for many people to enrich themselves, and especially in the countries with a long tradition of people looting the public funds and, moving them abroad. So we will be seeing a lot of that with this crisis as well.
So just to say to our audience, we really appreciate that you are watching. We know there are hundreds of people. We have your questions. I have also the Zoom Q&A. We'll go to them after, more or less in 20 minutes. But what I want to, remind you that though we're speaking at this particular day of the Chernobyl anniversary, that was the day to launch the Zero Corruption Conference. And the focus of the conference is the linkage between the corruption and money laundering with global security, environment, energy, and public health. So in this part of the discussion, I really want to get more about, the topic of corruption. But probably again, we'll start with Frank. We'll be happy to hear all your different thoughts, because we see that some people are, especially in the developing countries, they are very much, often accuse corruption as the main, problem. At the same time, we also understand that sometimes it's just very bad, poor governance. And when the democratic government can't deliver something, sometimes because of the corruption, sometimes because it's inefficient and it's working, that is the reason why the people would prefer to have authoritarian government. So how do you see, before we really get into the different discussions about corruption in healthcare, in every region, in every country, there are different problems with that, but how do you see that, especially looking, for instance, you have a lot of your students from a Soviet world, a lot of your students from developing countries, you're teaching the cases from the countries which are probably not the Danish democracy, but what are your concerns, and what are the things also for the governments, how to handle this kind of crisis, if also like to stop corruption but also to be efficient?
Well, that's a big question. I think that there's a couple of different answers. Ultimately, state capacity is a matter of people. It's a matter of having adequately educated and trained people running the government. I think ideally in a kind of impersonal bureaucracy where people have a sense of public interest that they put above their personal interest. And a lot of that is really a kind of, set of moral norms that in many countries is ingested as part of people's professional educations, right? So building that kind of basic state capacity, I think, is important. But there's a separate political issue, because it's not just the lack of capacity, it's also that there are many people that actually benefit from the weaknesses of the state, the lack of transparency that we've been discussing, and so forth. We actually just got done writing, a couple of cases about the healthcare sector in Ukraine, where that was obviously a weakness that was exploited by quite a few people that could profit over hiking prices for medicines and so forth. And in order to fix that category of problem, it's essentially political, because usually these actors are very powerful they're in ministries, or they're politicians, or they're in parliament, or in an authoritarian country, they're actually running the country itself. And unless you have a way of generating adequate political power to get them out of power, you're fundamentally not going to be able to deal with corruption. And so that's why I think that in very many places, the long-term solution to that second set of issues, the entrenched actors that benefit from a corrupt system, requires basic political skills of mobilization. You've got to get people that don't want this. I mean, civil society groups like ANTAC have to provide information to motivate people. You need political parties. You need, a coalition of political forces that ultimately will bring about the kind of political revolution that is, I think, the long-term only solution to this.
I just would say that, Francis, I haven't asked directly this question, but also the fact, like, how to ensure the efficient leadership in the time of pandemics was the question from Oksana Lesik, who works with the Minister of Infrastructure of Ukraine. So there are Ukrainian officials and civil servants who are concerned about that. But I see also, I probably would ask Serhiy and then later all others to respond. What are your concerns also for your native country? I'm misusing my position as the, Kyiv-based co-host for these international discussions, but to say, what are your concerns for the country like Ukraine, for our country, in particular, if we speak about, knowing that our healthcare system is bleeding from corruption for decades?
Well, recently we had Chernobyl fires, right? And one of the reasons why they were there, because for years and decades, the fire breaks that were supposed to be there were not there. And again, the big question whether it's lack of capacity or it is corruption. And Ukraine, again, it seems to me has to deal with both issues. Ukraine is good at maybe changing, if not political elites, then governments. And the problem is that the change doesn't bring much of a change in terms of the state capacity or the level of corruption. And my understanding is that what Ukraine needs really, it needs a political system in which parties are about ideology, parties about a particular program and vision that they're prepared to offer, as opposed to parties that are organized around people who are known because of show business, because they're outstanding people in the world of sport, and so on and so forth. It's easier said than done, because at the end it's the Ukrainian electorate that elects those particular people and those political parties. So I don't see, unfortunately, any quick fix. I see a long process ahead in which maturation happens both of the Ukrainian political elite and at the same time of the Ukrainian public and electorate. Because if Ukraine stays democratic, and I think it stays democratic, change can't come without actually changing of the attitudes of the electorate.
And we do have the participants who are looking forward to know and are concerned what's going on with Russia, in particular in terms of the coronavirus pandemics. And I would also refer to a couple of questions, but probably Roman, I will start. Will ask you. But just to remember, just to remind that we really appreciate the questions from the audience. So, for instance, Rostislav Valvoda from the Prague Civil Society Center asked. Do you see similarities in how the Soviet handled the Chernobyl disaster and how current autocrats like Russia deal with the pandemics today? Or the question was, Chernobyl disaster was one of the triggers to the last empire, destroying will the COVID-19 pandemics cause to the Putin's neo-empire extinction? This was, by the way, the questions to Serhiy, but I would address them to Roman. And we are very curious because we know that the Russian healthcare system is corrupt. However, it's a very rich country. It can be in some ways efficient, about the, stopping the public freedoms, for instance. But what are your thoughts about, what's happening in Russia and the Kremlin's answer to COVID-19? Referring also to the previous questions, they were from our audience.
Well, it's very difficult to give an expert opinion here, just because the information coming out of Russia is completely unreliable and not trustworthy. Because if you look at the number of tests that they are reporting, over 2 million tests, and number of positive cases, then either Russia is miraculously healthy country, where only like 2% of tested people happen to be sick with COVID, or alternative is probably the right one. It's these statistics do not reflect anything. In general, as we realize now, as somebody who had COVID, who recovered from this virus, I can tell you that in my case, I was diagnosed and tested, but I know 10 other people who were sick with me and never got tested and recovered. And I think that this ratio is pretty much holding across the globe. For one sick and identified tested person, there's probably 10 to 20 people who had either asymptomatic or take it easy as a common flu. So from that perspective, in Russia, if you look at the comparables, if you look at the statistics elsewhere, number of cases in Russia should be in hundreds of thousands, not tens. And clearly the state is hiding the real statistics. The healthcare system, as you just said yourself, it's bled completely and is incapable of catering, of coping with that. Moscow probably to some extent can. In the regions, there are just no resources, period. Therefore, people are diverted, not tested. Cases are not purposely misdiagnosed. People are dying from all different reasons. COVID is not mentioned on any death certificate. So it is very difficult to assess the real situation in Russia. You can only extrapolate from neighboring countries or regions. And from that perspective, I completely agree with Francis that it needs a popular support. The population itself should be tired of corruption, of healthcare system being completely pillaged by the bureaucrats, and they should require, through democratic processes, improvements in the leadership, in the system. Without that, it is impossible to influence the situation.
Francis or Sergey, I know you're a historian. Historians are not always don't always like to ask the guess the future, but still often there are a lot of questions to you. What would be the future of Russia, for instance, after the pandemics? How do you see? I see you're smiling, but I understand why these questions are coming.
Well, if you're looking for some optimistic things about the current situation, one of them actually may be Russia, because Putin was about to get this vote on the constitutional changes that would allow him to stay in power forever. There's going to be a big ceremony on May 9th to celebrate, the victory, and it was all going to be about him. He's not been able to do that. And I think that if Roman is right, that the pandemic is actually really pretty bad in Russia, you're not going to be able to hide that from your own population. And so this is one thing that, it seems to me potentially could weaken his legitimacy. It was dropping even before this crisis. And we don't know what's going on, but I wouldn't discount the fact that this may, have some long-term consequences in his political ability to survive. But I'd be interested in hearing Sergei.
Sergei, switch on your sound, yeah.
I have difficulty predicting history. But one thing that we certainly know from Chernobyl is that mishandling major catastrophes like that, mishandling information about them, can really cost authoritarian regime dearly. And again, that was mobilization around Chernobyl, it was already mentioned, was one of the very important factors leading eventually to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. But at the end of the day, that doesn't depend just on the scope of the disaster. That depends also on the how strong or not strong the authoritarian regime is. And at least at this point, I don't see any major change coming in Russia as a result of this pandemic. Partially also because it's relatively easy to hide what is going on. As Roman already explained, there is no indication why people are dying. The question of how many people are diagnosed and how many recover and so on and so forth. So it's really kind of a gray area where the authoritarian regime that controls pretty much, 90 or 99.9% of media that, especially when it comes to TV or major newspapers and so on and so forth, authoritarian regimes can actually operate quite well in that gray area. So I don't see anything coming immediately in Russia in terms of any change to the political regime, but I would be more than happy to be wrong.
And I think I want to use this privilege to have Miranda with us in this panel. And, it's often the places like Russia are discussed more often in these kind of panels. But I'm very curious. Let us all know how the Balkans, what is the view from the Balkans? How are you looking at your political situation, at your, relation with the European Union, with your, political leaders?
Actually, the situation is quite interesting here in the Balkans. So we have Serbia on one end, which is absolutely behaving like a dictatorship. So they're introducing a 4-day curfew where nobody's allowed to go out. And it's incredibly to watch that president is just making this random decision. One day it's this decision, next day it's this decision, but it's centered across limiting the freedoms of the people. And then on the other end, you have, Croatia, which is acting like other European countries. It's very reasonable, very accountable. There's lots of explanation, a lot of information that are being provided with the people. And then my country, because it is divided by 2 entities, so one entity is actually acting like Serbia, and they're also introducing curfews and stuff like that. In Federation, we had an evening curfew, so after 8 p.m. nobody was allowed to leave, but now that has been lifted and everybody's acting as if pandemic never happened and COVID is gone. So it's quite interesting. But the relationship between the countries are, in my country, we are very much looking up to European Union and, we're looking for assistance. But in Serbia, on the other hand, their friends are China and Russia. And they're actually, the President Vučić went to the airport and he was literally kissing the flag of China, saying how wonderful these friends are. And in a way, China and Russia are really using the pandemic to basically, firm up the control over and the way they're seen in Serbia. So it's kind of like, our countries are, part of them really wants to join EU, and then part of them is basically leaning more toward China and Russia.
And another country which I also just can't avoid this because, we here in Kyiv, we know this is the second country which suffered the most from Chernobyl accident was Belarus. And even in our questions, for instance, we have the question from the Italian journalist. I understand because it's a journalist from La Repubblica, Rosalba Castelletti. And asking if is the pandemic a new Chernobyl moment for Belarus. Just going here, I also read a few columns from the Belarusian journalists who speaking about the, that the Belarusian president Lukashenko, Belarus president Lukashenko also kind of pretends there is no really pandemic. The Europe and the neighbors are overdoing all this. I wonder, maybe Rebecca, you can also answer that, or anybody else from the panel. What do we do with these countries? We speak a lot about China, but we have, like this is our neighbors, and we somehow feel also the responsibility for what's going on.
So as far as I can observe, my former colleagues in the European Parliament, and especially also the people working as civil servants, leading civil servants in the European Commission, and our Commission's president and commissioners, they try their best to support the neighboring countries in this specific COVID crisis. This will not help in a country where the leadership is denying the problems. But the European support, the European solidarity developed for the Western Balkans and the Eastern Partnership countries is quite impressive. And I think this is something which should be known much more, especially in these exercises, repeated exercises, propaganda exercises coming from Russia and from China, and their fake support. It might sound a bit too strong to say fake support, but if I read the news about so-called Chinese humanitarian aid for Italy or the Balkans or Eastern Partnership countries, saying that the masks arriving from China, partly even really paid and not as a gift, they are not fulfilling the international norms, whereas the European Union is very generous in the support on all levels. And I think this propaganda issue should not suffer from not making known what the European Union is doing. Here in the European Union, I read a lot of articles about the possible failure of the European Union because of Corona crisis. The truth is that the European Union became very strong as an actor against the crisis, and especially also in support for our neighbors and partners.
So I want to thank also for everybody who is watching. I know it's quite challenging, people are not yet used for all this kind of the webinars, but we're going on. I just want to remind that there is the hashtag Zero Corruption Conference and the hashtag Lessons from Chernobyl. You can, tweet and go on the discussion online. I'm trying to incorporate all the questions. But what I'm feeling pity after our discussion that, yes, we haven't yet talked about environment, and that's something which I want to bring. I know that there is maybe much time for that, but for instance, I remember when we talked, and that's something which Serhiy mentioned in his book, that after the independence, all the nice and good legislation Ukrainian government introduced regarding the environment had been cancelled because it was a very poor economic situation. So there was the priority. Last Sunday, I could hardly open my window here in Kyiv because, there was a fire in Chernobyl. And we understand that you can't accuse just one person of that. This is the results of the decades of, not taking care about the environment. So now how we can see how maybe more cautious the countries will be, the governments will be. There was a question from Yulia Melnik from 350.org to Francis Fukuyama. What do you think about the Green New Deal? Could it be suitable for for Ukraine as the way of development and consolidation? So somehow the environment is still not the most popular topics. I think the COVID-19 will make us focus more. At the same time, there are the economic issues, and my concern is that in many countries, when there would be lack of funds, again, environment will be something which will suffer. So what are the environmental lessons from Chernobyl? What things still should be maintained, and how we also think about this in terms of the the long-term solution from after the COVID-19? Francis, are you there? You're the one to start. Yeah.
So in many ways, there are certain similarities. In the long run, climate change threatens to be an even bigger killer of people and a disruptor of politics than this pandemic. But the problem, it shows you what the political problem is, because when you have a pandemic where people get sick and things change, very, very rapidly, it's politically very easy to mobilize people to stay indoors, to observe these shutdowns, to spend, trillions of dollars in aid. And the whole problem with climate change is that it's such a slow-moving crisis that it's very hard to get people to realize that, their children's generation is going to be suffering just like they were in the middle of a pandemic, because what they see from year to year are these slight changes that really people adjust to and begin to discount. And so I think that if you're going to get to the point where people start taking this seriously, you're somehow going to have to transfer some of that sense of urgency to the issue of climate. It's beginning to happen in Europe, with the kind of mobilization of young people that's already taken place. Possibly this crisis will indicate to people, just what the impact of human economic activity on the environment has been. You have all these cities now that can see the sky for the first time because you don't have so many cars, and it may prod people's imaginations a little bit as to what might be possible. But again, it does face this really big problem of poor incentives when you move from one type of crisis to the other.
So, Rebecca, I also want to hear you at these terms, because you are this person who is very much pushing the environmental issue here in Ukraine. You need to switch on your sound, unmute yourself, and then we will hear you. Yeah.
So with sound and with better connection, as far as I see, fingers crossed. So I wished I could push more for sustainable development in Ukraine and also in other Eastern Partnership countries, but so it's difficult to understand that progress has a different shape if it's discussed today, and it's very difficult that to understand that, for example, in the energy sector, small is really beautiful and decentralized is much better than centralized technology. But I see a certain chance, not because of COVID-19, but because of the readiness of the European Union to really focus on the Green New Deal and to combine the economic recovery plans after COVID-19 with the needs of sustainable development, more sustainable development, and what they call the European Green Deal. I think I think it will be necessary for us as environmentalists to not forget in this very moment about the social needs. So after COVID-19 and with the decisions on the recovery plans, we have to bring in this Green New Deal. But we have to find ways to do it in a way that is also socially balanced. I would fear that if there is too strong emphasis for the Green New Deal, if there is not the same emphasis for the social needs and against so growing unemployment, we might lose as environmentalists. And the Green New Deal, in a way, is the best chance environmentalists had ever prepared to cope with social needs, but also with environmental needs.
So I just want, I want you all still, tackle this issue, but I want to make an announcement for our participants at Zoom. So be ready. There are a few questions we see, the great questions we have. It's not like we can't be able to answer all of them, but many of them are similar. So I would just pick up those which are different. But be ready that after this set of answers, if you want to pronounce your questions, I would name your name and you can log in. You can do it with the video or you can do it just with sound if you want. If not, I will read these questions. But maybe before going to that, so that's why I want to prepare that our audience is prepared to have our discussion more interactive. Maybe to finalize our round of the discussions, still, if to summarize it, what are the things you are the most concerned in this time of the pandemics, and what are the things which makes you hopeful? Who can start? Miranda.
Obviously, for me, who come from Bosnia, which is a country which is not that economically strong, my biggest concern is obviously our ability of our health system to survive the pandemic and make sure as many people get treated. But what I'm hopeful about is that I think people are much more aware about the corruption and how looting the public resources damages our ability to fight. Basically, how because of so much corruption, our health system is not at the level it should be. And I hope it's gonna let people to raise more questions. And basically, next time we have elections, that they're gonna take this into consideration and make sure that more public resources are actually spent in what is a public service for all the citizens.
So I want to, unless anybody wants to, again, give this, it's not yet final remark, but I want to see whether we can switch on to the Oktay Kaymak. It's I assume it's our participant. My colleagues probably would switch on the person because we want really to see the faces sometimes of the people. It's way harder than to be in the audience. So I'm looking whether we can give a floor to the Oktay Kaymak. He was one of the first. And I just would mention, good to see you, that this is a question which there were a few dozens of the people more or less had the very similar concern. So Oktay, switch on your mic. Let us know from where you're speaking and raise your question. I think you can speak. Yes. Hello. Hi. We are still trying. So I think that this, unfortunately, I think like the person was ready, but we want to have this a bit of moment of interaction rather than I would again read it. So you're ready to speak. If you're ready to speak, so you can start. Yes, we hear you. Not really. So the question was the how to maintain human and social security without sacrificing freedoms. What is the role of a democratic state also in the region where authoritarianism regains its appeal? I think there were the bunch of the very, very similar questions to to this. For instance, how to maintain our ethics at this moment. I won't remember who was the for instance, there was a question from the quite a similar question from the Gleb Bakalov from Ukrener, who said, like, in the times of crisis, people focus on survival and tend to cut corners and achieve results by all means. How to ensure ethics and integrity are not forgotten. So maybe you would answer. It's difficult. It's maybe philosophical, but we have a philosophers and historians here. I think Francis is there.
All right. Well, let me take a shot at that. I think that it's not that hard for a democracy to actually respond to a crisis. Usually, it does require an increase of executive authority because you need national responses when the nation as a whole is threatened. But that can be done in democracies with a grant of temporary power. But I think what's important is the word temporary. I think that what people like Viktor Orban in Hungary are doing is using that as an excuse to grab power on a long-term basis. And I think that we have to put the right kinds of constraints around our executive authorities as they deal with the crisis. And we have to make sure that, when they call for sacrifice and difficult actions, that it remains on a voluntary basis. And that the moment that crisis looks like it's easing, that those powers return to the people. And I think that there are democracies that have been able to do that. And I think if they're not doing it, as is the case in Hungary, we need to criticize them and hold them to account and make clear to people that this is not an acceptable way for a democracy to deal with a national emergency.
So Rebecca?
Since these Hungarian issues, the Viktor Orban issues are always coming back, I would like to say that I'm very much in favor of bringing the Hungarian case to the European Court. I think it's very important for the European Union to act based on law and based on rules. I'm very much against the idea to stop now suddenly payments to Hungary without having a clear decision about about this, what some people already call a coup by Orban for the European Union. And it's very diverse membership. There's a huge diversity among the member states nowadays. It's quite important to not act without obeying the rules and the legal basis. And I think in this way, what happened in Hungary now could become an example on also the European Union should deal with more and more wish for authoritarian leadership in some of the countries.
So we have at 6:52 Kyiv time the question from Senat Pechanin. I'm sorry, I don't fully see from where you're coming to how to spell the name, and see whether this could be asked by our participant. I just want everybody to be ready. If you sign up for the question, it dropped on. But if you sign up for the question, be ready. If you really, really want to speak out. No, I think that we don't see that. But Francis, that was again the question for you. I think I'm used this opportunity. The question was about, would liberal order survive possibly the second term of President Trump, and I think like we all thinking how the pandemics will influence the situation. And I probably would ask this question to Serhiy, who is currently based in Boston. and you see it from the other side of the US?
Okay, well, I hope that this doesn't sound like an excessively partisan point of view, but I really do think that as a student of democracy, we're facing a big crisis of democracy in the United States, because I think for the first time in my lifetime, we have a leader that does not understand fundamental issues like what the rule of law is. And I think he's done a lot of damage, both on a domestic level and on an international level. Like his, removing the subsidy to the WHO is just the latest example of that. So I think that the election that we're going to have in November is going to be one of the most important, not just for the United States, but I think globally, because the United States remains a very important country. If you look at the comparison of democracy versus authoritarian government, people thought that China was doing really badly in the early days in January and February. And then as the United States became the single greatest, we account for 1/4 of all of the deaths from COVID-19 at the moment around the world, which is a horrible record. And so if we manage to re-elect somebody that presided over this kind of a disaster, it's hard to imagine what the negative consequences will be. I do think there are a number of signs that this will not happen because his popularity has been dropping. And I think that, this kind of a performance in the midst of a crisis is not something that gets leaders reelected. But unfortunately, I've been wrong about judging the mood of the American people in the past. But I'm still hoping for the best.
Serhii. Switch on your sound.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes. The latest news apparently is that the popularity of President Trump is falling, partially because of very unorthodox advices that he gives to the population on how to cure themselves from the disease. And a number of senators are, of course, concerned about their position and what will happen in November elections. Again, it looks like that the current president in the United States is not handling very well crisis. And my main concern is, of course, the consequences for the country. And I look at pain on many levels, from people who suffer from the disease, but also from people who now don't have paychecks. The economy is not moving anywhere. And in time like that, this is a classic time of crisis. You need really strong leadership. And that country in particular lacks it today. And again, it certainly is not there to lead the world for a long period of time. But now the question is whether the current leadership can get the country out of this crisis with minimal losses. So it's not good.
So we have the number of questions, and we know that this participant is really raising the hand virtually. This is Daniel from Romania, who has a few questions to Miranda, to Rebecca. So Daniel, we are trying this technology, all of us. It's a bit new. I know there are professors who are giving seminars all the time. I think like you'll be, Serhii and Francis, the experts of Zoom in a while. But Daniel, we see you. So are you talking from Budapest? Let us know from where are you, and please, word for you. We're happy to unite all at this panel.
Hello to everyone. Close enough. I'm talking from Chisinau, actually, the capital of Moldavia. I have a question which is addressed directly to Francis, but all the other panelists can join in. And the question is, will the world's countries move to a more social democratic type of ruling regimes after this pandemic? Because from what we can see, when the tsunami strikes or the coronavirus strikes or any other major event, the state is the one doing the heavy lifting, the only one which is not asking for insurance cards and everything. Because, for example, we had an example in Eastern Europe, in Romania, where private hospitals shut their doors in front of COVID-19 patients and sent them over to the state. So I'm actually curious if this whole capitalistic, very private-oriented regimes are going to be more oriented towards a social democracy.
Okay. Who will answer? Yeah, Serhii and Francis.
But this is for Francis. Francis is ready.
Oh, this is for Francis, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I think that a rational response would be to actually move in this social democratic direction, because I think this kind of period of neoliberalism that we've been under for the last 30, 40 years has proven, inadequate. It's weakened state structures and shifted the emphasis to the private sector in a way that is really inadequate to meet the needs of, the world living under COVID. But the problem is that we're living in this also strange cognitive state where rational responses and social learning don't necessarily happen because, demagogic politicians are able to spin events in very different ways, and people end up believing in conspiracy theories and, anti-elite ideas that elites are really working behind their backs to undermine the democratic publics and so forth. And so it really depends on the way that we actually interpret the things that have been happening to us. And I would say that, with the rise of the internet and social media, our cognitive abilities have really been scrambled. And that's my greatest fear going into the future, that we won't be able to draw the appropriate lessons, even though I think rationally we should move in the direction that you suggested.
If I can add, in terms of political change, as a historian, I have this impression that the world moves in waves, in a sense that there is a certain political fashion that emerges in the world that exists for 10, 15 years, and it changes. And the fashion that really captured the world after the recession of 2008 was this movement towards authoritarianism on different levels. And it's already 12 years, more or less, as that wave continues. It will come to an end at some point, and it will come to an end when there will be a realization that that particular model doesn't work, doesn't actually serve societies. And that normally comes at the moment of crisis. So I'm not excluding that pandemic can serve that role. Again, it's not directly to the question about moving in social democratic direction, but it's more about the question of authoritarian tendency versus more democratic tendencies in the world as a fashion, a political fashion.
Thank you for the answer. I think we are almost rounding up. I still would try, maybe we can switch on the Romualdas Patkevicius. I wonder, if not, I would use this, would say it aloud. Most probably not, and to save the time, I wonder if it would be, Roman, for you. I know that you're investment banker. We see the Romualdas. Yes, if you can hear us and try, let at least try. Maybe the next seminar we would have, Oh, Romualdas, yes. Let us know from where you're talking and ask your question, please.
Yes, I'm from Vilnius, Lithuania, director of NATO Energy Security Center of Excellence. I was supposed to be at your real event in Vilnius, but I wanted to ask probably to Roman about Russia and energy crisis, and he mentioned about funds outflow from Russia to the kind of more secure locations. So, is the energy sector of Russia is going to be able to recover after this COVID crisis related to energy crisis? And also in Ukraine, is energy sector somehow affected? And maybe in the future, after COVID, Ukraine will turn to less dependency on Russian gas, and maybe switch, as it was mentioned before, to more renewable, more sustainable energy sources, or at least to try to do it. So double question.
Thank you, Romaldis. Raman, switch on your yeah.
Yeah, the answer totally depends on the price of oil in international markets. Russian oil production is mostly 75% state held, and oil and gas contribute vast majority of the government revenues. Therefore, at this levels, these prices that we've seen this week, for example, it's next to loss making for the government. The government is not making in export revenues. It's making, I believe, $1 million a day. Clearly, $350 million is not going to sustain the country, and this would need to be the prices would need to be to double at least for the energy sector in Russia to be to overcome this crisis. As to Ukraine, I believe it could be beneficial as a net consumer of energy, though I'm not an expert on the Ukrainian economy.
That would be, look, I think that we are almost, it's not like we're running out of time. It's quite challenging to keep people to be focused, but that's not yet the end. I think that there is, there are many questions, but I want you, at least all our speakers, to have them in your mind, in your readings, what people are worried. So that I would not, we won't now ask all the questions one by one, but I would use this chance to provide your final thoughts. But before I would, mark some people, I think that their efforts to ask the questions should be encouraged and appreciated. So these are the thoughts our participants of our panel, the viewers have. For instance, Robert Omans said, what the COVID crisis has brought to me is how fragile democracy and freedoms are. Stanislav Zhelichovsky asking, is it necessary for the international communities to set up a separate international organizations with a special budget in order to better anticipate such crises? Brooke Horowitz says that I'm not so sure that the pandemic will necessarily lead to an increase of authoritarianism and corruption in countries where the governments handle the crisis well. There will be a renewal of social contract based on higher level of trust in the government. In countries which handle the crisis badly, we may see the public pushback, like the Chernobyl crisis was the first step towards the disintegration of the USSR. Murat Toumey said there had been bad reactions to COVID-19 pandemics, both from democratic and authoritarian states, and good reaction again from democratic and authoritarian states. Does that show that it's not a problem with the state system, but with people and leadership personality? So that's something. Shortly, Frank was mentioned. There are many. So this is the questions which I understand worried our audience. So, for instance, Olena Haritonova asking, will activism become a political force capable to unite a fragmented, renationalized world? Artyom Teslenko is worried what a return to work may look like. Will we see the spike in remote jobs after the end of COVID-19, or people will be tired from staying at home? Michael Elk asked, in particular, Dr. Fukuyama, do you still assert that political and economic liberalism will be eventual winner globally vis-a-vis surges in populism and economic inequality, plus advances in biotechnology? Mikola Kuzmin asking how to deal with the issue of privacy during the coronavirus outbreak. Of course, it is unnecessary to give up the fundamental rights in order to tackle the pandemics, but how to follow this example of countries like South Korea and Taiwan. So this is the more or less the quite a representative group of questions from most of our speakers. There are the questions whether from Georgi Mihev, should we think pandemics causes by COVID-19 as the beginning of the new world order? So to finalize, I first of all maybe want to give, if not to all, to some of you to say this final remarks. The Zero Corruption Conference was aimed and planned as also the solution conference. So maybe if you would pick up one thing you think we can do, one thing we can, learn now. Our event was named the lessons from Chernobyl, but it also the lessons from the COVID-19. If there are the things you think we can learn now, what that would be? Who would give this short? Maybe Roman. What will be? I see Sergei. Yeah. Please switch on your. Yeah.
You can hear me. Yeah. My response on lessons is directly to one of the questions about whether we should create a new international organization or not to deal with the future crises like that. Well, the general statement is that the international crisis like that, the only effective response is international. It can't be only on the national level. And I would say that we should work with the institutions and structures that are already in place, and would like to bring the International Atomic Energy Organization as an example, because it was attacked quite justly in 1986 to helping the Soviet Union with a cover-up. So they were too close, too cozy with the Gorbachev's government to a degree that the same level of criticism now we can hear toward World Health Organization. But eventually they turned things around and they opened the Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union for introduction of the elements of safety culture in the nuclear industry. And I think that that's where the efforts should go the moment we open our borders. So strengthening international institutions that are already there and try to reform them and make less dependent on the money coming from one particular source, either from the United States of America, or from China, or somewhere else.
Roman, do you see what are the things you think we can already use? What are the solutions we can use already?
Well, look, it's very difficult to predict. I mean, it's clear that, as Yogi Berra used to say, the future ain't to what it used to be. What exactly is going to be? I agree with Sergei that one is very obvious, that WHO needs to be reformed and needs to be strengthened, needs to be beefed up. Its role, instead of cutting funding, countries really should contribute more and make sure that we have an international crisis center that is capable of handling pandemics, or at least being more proactive in handling pandemics like that, because unfortunately it's not the last one to come. And God forbid, second wave or mutation of this virus, but clearly it needs to be better organized and coordinated globally, not within one country. And for that, we need different bodies. So that's being Captain Obvious, though.
Miranda, what are the solutions we are looking at? Maybe short term, that's still okay.
Well, so I don't know if any of you watched the documentary series Pandemic on Netflix. I never really gave it much thought that it would be a big pandemic. I never paid attention, but actually it was interesting to see here that people have been speaking for many years that there will be a next pandemic, and there was plenty scientists who were going around different parts of the world collecting samples and monitoring animals and trying to figure out, where the next pandemic will come. I think bigger problem is that we don't listen enough to the scientific community, and that we don't give them enough space, and any efforts in terms of environment are being shattered, and there are too many economic interests. So I would say, what we need to do is listen and pay attention to what those who know much better than we do are telling us, and hold authorities accountable for when they don't listen.
Rebecca, I've seen, though you are in Lower Saxonia, ways far away, but I've seen you were making notes to give us the final solutions to the problems we're discussing. Rebecca?
Yeah, here I am. I made some notes about what other speakers said.
Okay.
Think about it later. I feel a bit lost in all these debates about what will be after COVID-19 and how the world will change. I have to admit that I have more hopes than an opinion. And so mainly I hope that so the democratic world finds back to its own strengths. So Trump is a real problem for what we called the West, and hopefully the reasonable Americans now decide that he should not have another term as a president. Then it might be easier for the West and the democratic world to recover, not from but maybe with COVID-19. We will see, for example, huge stimulus programs. So these social democratic ideas of how to recover will be very strong implemented even by non-social democratic governments. And what I really hope is that in the West, there will not be a vicious competition after COVID-19, but some reasonable decisions how to recover together. And again, I would like to say that in this, I hope that the ideas of Green Deal and sustainable development in the Western countries are taken hopefully very serious for the time of the big stimulus.
And thank you, Rebecca. And Francis, we're almost ending, but I think that you can give us a home task, because I think we will be back for the real conference in Kyiv in autumn. We'll talk about it just in a minute, but maybe there are some things to prepare. So we give there are some solutions we can start already, to work in and to see whether we will be better prepared in half a year.
Well, I would say a couple of things. I think that every country needs to invest more in its public sector to boost its capacity, particularly in the health sector, and to really be able to provide universal basic health coverage to all of its citizens without, discrimination and so forth. And then I'd like to underline what Rebecca said. I really hope the United States actually re-enters the international community and resumes the kind of leadership role that it had played over many decades. We've been on a kind of vacation over the last 3.5 years, and I hope that ends, so that by the time we have the real conference, the conditions for international cooperation will be much better.
Thank you, Francis. And one of the first questions we had in our Zoom event was, so when the conference will happen? And for this, and not just, I want to give floor to Daria Kaliniuk, who is Anti-Corruption Action Center Executive Director. And later she would also give a word to Hanna Hopko, who is Zero Corruption Conference Chair, also the Ukrainian activist and politician. So Daria, that's your turn finally. And I want, just from my behalf, to thank you for the idea of the Zero Corruption Conference and the fact that we're having these debates today. I know that's yours and Anna's idea. Okay, Daria.
Thank you, Natalia. I actually want to say one thing, that behind any crisis, any pandemics, any catastrophe are human lives. And there is a life of a brilliant person, an average person who at 1986 became a liquidator of Chernobyl catastrophe. This is the life of Oleg Vaklenko. He is a professor from Kharkiv who makes posters and who draws. And since 1991, he is organizing international triennale among designers of the posters to reflect on the most challenging social problems. And this year, we partnered with his organization, Force Block, and conducted this international competition of posters. And today, we're supposed actually to be in Chernobyl and to present the best of the best works of art design. We were not able to do that. We hope we will do that in autumn. I don't know what will be the dates. Early September, probably December. Probably it will be even in April next year. We don't know. It's a very unpredictable world. But I encourage everyone to go into our online gallery and to reflect on these posters. Because in the life of unpredictability, I think that every citizen and every one of us, even without not having formal authority, how to do what we can where we are. And I'm very thankful to those designers who presented their works and their contribution to resolution of the most challenging threats to the world. This is all I wanted to say, and more about the conference and about its goal. I think Hanna Hopko, the chair of our initiative, will be able to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Daria. Thank you, everybody. So I do believe that this year, or I don't even want to think about the next year, but finally we will meet. And of course, we will be discussing about the solutions and how to tackle the problems, the linkages between dirty money and corruption and how it influences our environment, energy, and security. And also, let me express our gratitude to our moderator, Natalia Humenyuk, for wonderful discussion today, and for all our honorable speakers and your contributions. And of course, I have to mention all confirmed speakers from the EU, from Latvia, like Speaker of Latvia, and also from NATO. And we have Barbora Marunkova also today among the attendees. So I do believe that all confirmed speakers will participate in the future offline conference. So, and we will have a good debates and then shape the agenda for the future, because the key idea, probably not too naive, but still too philosophical, the zero corruption future we are gonna to reach one day, and Ukraine is the best place to discuss this. And also today, when we are discussing about Chernobyl and pandemic, we have to remind everybody about another pandemic that Ukraine is facing already 7 years. I mean, Russian military aggression. It costed already 14,000 of lives and more than 1.7 million of IDPs, internally displaced people. And of course, it's important when today we are discussing about Chernobyl as the last push for Soviet Union collapse. So, and we have to also discuss today what could potentially become the last push for the Putinism collapse. Because successful Ukraine is really important one day for to transform Russian Federation. And this is also one of our key goals when Ukrainian civil society organizations are fighting for better future, building a strong democracy, fighting for the rule of law to have rule of law in Ukraine. So we believe that successful Ukraine could become a trigger for transformation of Russian Federation. And of course, we are analyzing what's happening now with COVID-19. And we are seeing very proactive coronavirus Russian diplomacy as an element of Russian propaganda, together with the humanitarian aid which could be considered as a Trojan horse for extending Russian influence on the democratic societies. So I think it's really important when we are talking about the solutions, having Miranda here with us. And we are now seeing how Western Balkans are integrating into the European Union. And recently, NATO received the 30th member, North Macedonia. So we do believe that with good reforms in Ukraine, one day we could also potentially become a member of NATO. And also, I think that for future debates and discussions, it's also important to form the agenda, and we already launched our website where you could see all information about 3 days of the conference, but the exact days we will inform you soon. So I think the key is the truth, and I'm optimistic about the future. And even now, if now we have crisis, the crisis is also a good opportunity to rethink our lifestyle and also to take more responsibility. And also, since we have two historians with us, and today my former colleague from Verkhovna Rada, who used to be a liquidator in May 1906, he posted his memories, and he posted one quote when he entered Chernobyl area. There was one quote, one poster: Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, named after Lenin, works for communism. So I think that it's really important to remember how many lives, the millions of lives during the totalitarian regime was killed, and not to allow authoritarian regimes in 21st centuries by hiding the truth, also to continue their hybrid aggression, to continue their propaganda and others. So strong democracies, truth, strong civil societies, access to the information, fact-checking. This is what we are fighting for with environmental activists, with another partners of the conference, like the New Europe Center, then Environmental People Law Organization, also Life Organization, and many others with the leadership of ANTAC. So I think it's really important to have the conference next year, to make it annual conference debates, and to shape agenda for zero corruption future. Even if it sounds like an utopia, but it's worth to try than not to do this. So thank you for today's discussion. Thanks Natalia, thanks Miranda, Francis, Rebecca, and also Sergey for his all books. So we are enjoying by reading these books, and thanks everybody for today's discussion.
So there are still a few people to thank, not just people, just institutions. Thank you, Daria and Anna. So we just want to mention, and we are happy to mention, that the event and the conference itself is supported by USAID Engage, actively implemented by PACT, the EU Anti-Corruption Initiative in Ukraine, which is a program financed by the European Union and the co-financed and implemented by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark, the National Endowment for Democracy, Prague Civil Society Center, and Western NIS Enterprise Fund. I want to also thank our audience, everybody who asked the questions, who listened. You can share the video will be available on YouTube. It's on Facebook. You can, there are tweets, so you can share and go on this discussion. I'm also sure that we're not just waiting for the conference to happen. There would be more discussion like this. And I want our speakers to smile, because we tried to make an online photo for this, like the final photo. That would be a screenshot. So I would just say that, again, incredible discussion, and thanks so much to Rebecca Harms from who is talking to us from Lower Saxonia. We just talked Hanna Hopko, who was speaking from Lviv, Miranda Patruric, the leading investigative reporter from the OCCRP, Roman Borisovich, an anti-corruption activist, who is now talking to us from Luxembourg, an American Ukrainian historian and author Serhiy Prokhy talking to us from Boston, and from California, Francis Fukuyama, the historian and American philosopher. So thank you again. Talk to you. And that was also myself, Natalia Gumenyuk, a Ukrainian journalist, was privileged to run this discussion from Kyiv, Ukraine. So goodbye. We can, wave to each other as if it's real. Yeah.
Привіт! Мене звуть Світлана, і я вже давно сплачую квитанції в інтернеті. 2 години в черзі? Ні,